We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 12th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. With a view across some of Switzerland's highest peaks, this is The Globalist, live from Wengen in the heart of the Bernese Oberland. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up in the next 60 minutes, how does the security situation in Los Angeles play out? Our executive editor and former LA correspondent Chris Lord joins me here in Wengen to examine what happens next. Also coming up,
as far as the two-state solution is concerned, it's an aspirational goal, but the question is, where should that be?
The US envoy to Israel, Mike Huckabee, says the US is no longer pursuing the goal of an independent Palestinian state. We'll explore this realignment of America's goals. Plus,
I don't think any of us are caught up or will catch up to something that's moving at this velocity.
The executive chairman of Sky News explains to us how the media is navigating the world of artificial intelligence. And as we gaze out at the beauty of Switzerland's mountains, we look at how those same slopes are posing problems for a country trying to future-proof its communities from natural threats. Plus the papers too. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from Wengen in Switzerland. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. The US is to evacuate its embassy staff from Baghdad due to a heightened security threat in Iraq. Argentina's President Javier Milei says his country will move its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem next year. And the US has launched a review of its submarine deal with the UK and Australia. Washington saying any security pact must fit its America First agenda. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, I think we need to give you a little bit of a scene setter this morning. We are here as guests of the Grand Hotel Belvedere, tucked above the alpine town of Wengen in Switzerland. Famed for its wooden chalets, the invention of the slalom, accessible only by train, and offering some of the most spectacular views across Switzerland's Bernese Alps, this town is enjoying a renaissance. And before we get into the main meat and drink of today's programme, I think we need to hear from Lawrence Mauer, who's General Manager of the Grand Hotel Belvedere. A very good morning to you.
Hi, Emma.
Thank you for letting us transform your beautiful new bar into an impromptu radio studio.
Pleasure.
It is probably the driest number of people you've ever had in this room. And also Chris Lord, our Executive Editor and former LA correspondent, so you'll be talking to us about a little bit what's happening overnight in Los Angeles. But first, Lawrence, a bit of a scene setter, if you wouldn't mind. It's really difficult to do any work here because there's a rather beautiful view outside which kind of stops us all in our tracks.
If you look outside this window here, you see the Lauterbrunnen Valley with the imposing waterfalls. And of course, dominating the valley is our Jungfrau Mountain, 4,158 meters high. Still snow covered in early June still, so we'll have snow all year.
Thank you very much indeed. And you're opening the hotel for its first big summer season, aren't you? The first 5-star hotel in Wengen.
Exactly. We're really pleased to have Monocle here over the next 3 days. The cherry on the top of the first 5-star hotel is really the Monocle shop opening tonight. So please come and visit us.
Thank you very much for that massive advert. That was great. Most appreciated, Lawrence. We have a little bit of an audience in here as well. We've decamped up from, well, all over Europe. Quite a lot of friends and family of Monocle have come up to spend a couple of days up in Wengen. And leading the charge of the Monocle group is Chris Lord, our executive editor. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
How was the bar last night?
Well, we're back in the bar.
Yes.
which is a good sign. fine. Look, it was great in here last night. We had a few Alpine spritzes mixed up quite late into the night. I think we had a great dinner, and I think a lot of people are kind of discovering this extraordinary little town that we found ourselves in.
It is absolutely extraordinary. We'll be hearing a little bit more from you, Laurence, and also the head chef, Will, in a little while. So just to give you a little bit of a taste of what it's like in a rather tricky to get to, but well worth the journey location. But first, let's move into some of the news that we've been following this past day or so. Chris, I think we should have a look at what's happening in Los Angeles at the moment. We have a curfew now, which has been, it's in situ at the moment, but it seems to have been working. There's been what's described as an uneasy calm in Los Angeles at the moment.
Yeah, the mayor, Karen Bass, yesterday recognised that the curfew has essentially worked, which is the sheer number of people who had descended on Los Angeles in the centre of town, into downtown LA. They have been now, most of those people who refused to leave have been arrested, and the sheer volume of military that was deployed on there, the National Guard and also the Marines, are now sort of looking for what to do next. I think it creates a bit of a powder keg moment, I would say, and I think the mayor recognised that we are seeing other protests break out around the US in other cities, and those mayors are going to have to make the difficult decision: is, are we going to start rounding up essentially our citizens who are saying that they don't agree with federal policy and detaining them? And that is going to be a very difficult decision that a lot of cities are going to have to make now.
There was a very interesting statement made by General Scott Sherman, who's the general leading the deployment of the Marines to Los Angeles. And as the rhetoric was ramping up yesterday, he stepped in and clarified what the position was for the Marines, wasn't it? That this is clear, they cannot arrest people, however they can detain people until the police arrive. Now, this is clearly a very delicate balance that the military has to strike, doesn't it? Because it has the pressure of the White House bearing down on it, saying, get in there, get trained, and do our bidding. Yet at the same time, on the ground, it has to be incredibly sensitive.
The line that came out was, if they spit, we hit, which is the idea that the military would start directly getting involved in these protests. Now, those who actually have an involvement in the military, as in the ones who have to define policy, know that is such a step change in how military could engage with civilians in the United States. And so I think there was a bit of a clarifying moment there compared to some of the rhetoric that's coming from Donald Trump himself from the Oval Office and the people around him. But I do think we have to be sort of cautiously sort of aware that essentially this doesn't stop here. You know, the mass deportations that Donald Trump promised on the campaign trail are not going to slow down. In fact, they're going to need to speed up. At the moment, there's been about 600 people a day being detained with the view to ultimately being deported as illegal immigrants in the United States. Their plan is to get that into the thousands. And to get there, they're going to have to do more of these sort of what kicked off the LA riots, which is these kind of sort of vans going around certain areas and frankly rounding people up and going into businesses and getting people out. That's going to be distressing in a lot of cities, and you're going to see the civilian response that we've seen in LA. And I also don't think it stops for LA either. I mean, I think that there is a population there traumatized by wildfires that the city started the year with, who are also wondering what their future looks like in the country. And now that they've set up a provocation where the military gets involved when, frankly, very small groups of people gather to show their disquiet, that sets up a precedent that the White House is not going to miss the opportunity for the same optics in other situations. And
indeed, that has been mentioned. There are messages coming out of the White House are, you think this is going to stop at LA. This is wrong. There are other cities which are on Washington's radar which could quite easily see Marines and National Guard turning up quite soon. And that develops a more long-term rhetoric, doesn't it?
Look, I think Donald Trump sees himself in the best position is when he's in battle. He likes to set himself up against a cause or a group of people or an organization or someone who wants to dance. And he sort of thrives in those moments where he can, frankly, use the bully pulpit to shout people down and to send troops in when it's necessary. I think that is, the precedent has been set, the taboo has been broken, and the overreach that came by essentially going over the head of Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, by sending troops in, it takes a long time to repair something like that. And I think that there's going to be now a realization that the media is incredibly interested in this story. There was a line overnight that by one protester saying there's more reporters in the centre of LA than there are protesters. So there's a lot of media interest, and that is where Trump's interest lies. He can get the media talking, he can get a huge amount of coverage for his policies.
Let's move on while I've got you here to talk about some more news that's broken overnight, which is AUKUS, the deal that was struck for a nuclear submarine program among the Australians, the British and the United States, something that was, it caused an awful lot of trouble when it first emerged, given the fact that it pushed France out of the spotlight. And that was the focus then. But what we're seeing now is Washington saying, we're going to review this because this is going to be possibly not congruent with the America First policy. This, if this happens, is huge.
It is huge. It is huge. Just to remind what AUKUS was. So, as you say, it was a sort of intelligence, knowledge-sharing program between those three nations that was a signature foreign policy piece by Joe Biden, former president of the United States. So, just that very fact puts it in the line of fire for the current administration, who want to do everything they possibly can to unwind stuff that's associated with the previous administration. But actually, what that pact was about was essentially trying to get Australia, a country that did not have a sufficient nuclear submarine program and didn't have the industrial base to build its own, how do they support them between those three nations to build their own subs, using quite often American shipyards to do it, using British shipyards as well, using that knowledge sharing, and really, if you like, creating a sort of emerging new military alliance beyond NATO, beyond sort of old Five Eyes connections of intelligence sharing, that's really about hard power and about manufacturing base. The reason this is being reviewed, beyond the Joe Biden concern, is that I think that there is a recognition in the United States that they just do not actually have that manufacturing base that they promised. And so to build those kind of nuclear submarines that was given a certain date of when they would deliver them for Australia would take a lot of manufacturing time and energy out of shipyards in America, limited shipyards, that frankly they see the need to bolster their own navy before they start helping other people. And this is, I think this is the crux of it. There is a feeling from Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, down in the Pentagon, that America is far too tied up in Europe and in Ukraine and needs to be looking to the Pacific and to China.
Chris, thank you very much indeed for that. What's the plans for Chris Lord this afternoon? We've got a full day ahead of us, and there's a little audience gathered now in this bar, all of whom have got coffees, I think, more or less, and people looking very happy indeed. There's a lot of eyes on us. There is a lot of eyes on us, yes. But we're going to be heading up into the mountain in probably about an hour or so's time. After this show concludes, we're going to get together, get up into the funicular, take it right up into the mountain, and we've got a bit of a hike through there, followed by a nice barbecue, right? We have actually had a bet thrown down that can we actually broadcast from the top of a mountain? And we're going to do it, aren't we? We're going to try. Desi Bandley is looking away when we're saying that. Chris Lord, thank you so much for joining me. I was going to say in the studio, but in the bar. You're listening to The Globalist live from Wengen in Switzerland. The time is 9:12 in Gaza, 7:12 in London, and an update now on the Middle East as the US envoy to Israel, Mike Huckabee, has said Washington is no longer pursuing the goal of an independent Palestinian state. It's being seen as the clearest sign yet that the Trump administration is distancing itself from a key pillar of the US Middle East diplomatic strategy. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by Ruth Michelson, journalist and Middle East correspondent based in Istanbul. A very good morning to you, Ruth.
Good morning.
This is a big move, but it is, one could argue, widely expected.
It is widely expected, although what I think is quite interesting here is how much after the comments by the US ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, saying that he doesn't think that there's a future for the two-state solution, that then we actually saw that the State Department spokesperson, Tammy Bruce, that she started to sort of distance the Trump administration from Huckabee's comments. So she literally said to reporters, "I'm not going to explain them or comment on them at all. I certainly think he speaks for himself." Now, you could argue that Huckabee was just sort of talking about the writing on the wall, that the way that the Trump administration has allowed, for example, settlement expansion to continue, or the parts of the Israeli state that they have empowered through Netanyahu's government, which are the parts that are driving this, the government that's supporting settlement expansion and making the possibility of a two-state solution more remote. That this is kind of just de facto the situation. But really what this comes down to is the idea that actually Trump is making foreign policy on the fly, that his administration has built into it this idea that Huckabee can make these comments because of his own personal, political, and religious beliefs. Huckabee comes from a wing of the evangelical movement that is staunchly pro-Israel and was seen as quite a bold choice when it comes to picking him for ambassador for this kind of sensitive position. And so there is a sense, even though Huckabee's made these comments, that maybe they reflect something in the Trump administration, or maybe Trump and his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, will just decide that there's a different kind of policy altogether.
This Trump making foreign policy on the fly, this schism between what is, or this lack of sort of a single narrative coming from the White House and from the US envoy to Israel, it may be an example of what is happening in terms of the US foreign policy. But for those who are actually experiencing the situation on the ground, what does this now mean?
Well, I mean, I think that there's been a growing resentment for a long time, an outcry from across the Middle East, including among Palestinians, about the Israeli state trying to create what they would term facts on the ground. So if we look, for example, at the end of May, the Israeli government said that it plans to build 22 new settlements in the occupied West Bank. So that includes formally recognizing a number of outposts that were previously seen as unauthorized, even by the Israeli government. So from the perspective of the Israeli authorities, what they are doing is saying we are codifying or legalizing or building these new settlements, and there's simply nothing that anyone that objects to this can do anything about it. And, what we're seeing from the Trump administration is a certain distance from all of this, that Trump has certainly done plenty of things recently that Netanyahu and his administration don't like, in terms of, for example, the Trump administration's dealings with Syria, just to name one example, ongoing negotiations with Iran. But at the same time, when it comes to this kinds of distance, yes, he's not necessarily, confronting Netanyahu about all of these things, but they're also just kind of letting this happen. They're not saying that anything is they're not flagging any of this as a problem. They're not signaling that any of it needs to stop. And what's happening over time is that, as the Israeli authorities want, is creating facts on the ground that are changing people's lived experience in a real way.
And the way that this is being received in the rest of the Middle East, to make the suggestion that the goal of an independent Palestinian state, that will not go down well with several key players and indeed potential great allies of the United States. I'm just thinking of Saudi Arabia.
That is true. And I mean, we've certainly seen that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has said for some time that he, despite this US pressure for there to be normalization talks with Israel, that there is a real realization within Saudi Arabia that people want to see an independent Palestinian state before there could be any public discussion of normalization with Israel. Egypt is another example. If we look at what the Trump administration has suggested for Gaza, Trump talking about turning it into the Riviera of the Middle East and building properties on there, and essentially conducting a mass deportation, what some people would label ethnic cleansing, to force Palestinians out of Gaza and into the Sinai. That is something that that the Egyptians for a long time, and also Jordan, have flagged as something that they, even the idea of it as a temporary measure, they fear it would become permanent. They fear it would be a repeat of what happened in 1948. And they fear that this would mean the permanent expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza and from the West Bank.
And briefly, Ruth, just looking further ahead, because the Trump administration indefinitely, the way that America's role in Middle East diplomacy will be formed, the fact that things are being changed so profoundly now.
Yes, I mean, there's an absolute overhaul of what the Trump administration is doing across the region, Syria being a very key example there. And once again, it seems like Trump is trying to make foreign policy on the fly, but within that, there is this sense that what's happening in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza is somewhat exceptional, and that the Trump administration is turning a blind eye, particularly in Gaza, to a situation that is becoming worse by the day. Over 55,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza since the war began. Ongoing fears about what is happening with a US-backed aid distribution system, where dozens of people have been killed again at one of the distribution sites. And so there are real fears about what the Trump administration is supporting, either by tacitly ignoring it or by design.
Ruth Michelson, journalist and Middle East correspondent, joining us on the line from Istanbul. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
According to Hiroshi Okuyama, Yanmar's chief digital officer, the company's aim is to integrate the various Yanmar industries and technologies to tackle economic problems as one ecosystem.
We'll find out how a Japanese heritage brand is embracing renewable energy to support the country's agriculture. Stay with us on The Globalist, live from Wengen in Switzerland.
IQ, EQ, and AI. 3 components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence, all to elevate you. UBS. Banking is our craft.
The time here at the Grand Hotel Belvedere in Wengen is 8:22. Normally, I'm in a room by myself in London, which is a rather wonderful thing to be. This morning, I'm surrounded by a nice group of people who've sort of come into the bar to have a look at Monocle doing its thing. A very good morning to everybody. Good morning. Coffee's being served everywhere. People settling in, gazing at the glorious view outside the hotel. So this is a very public sort of manifestation of the globalist. Let's cross back down to a more sedate location, back to the site of lots of activity, Midori House, back in London. Monocle's Alexis Self, our foreign editor, is joining me from Studio One to bring us up to date with the papers. But good morning, Alexis. How are things where you are?
Guten Tag, Emma. Yeah, it's nice. I'm with Elliot here. It's warm in London. It's balmy. It's one of those lovely London mornings where you can feel the heat rising, and very green city at the moment. So we're doing good over here.
Glad to hear it. Let's have a look at the papers. We mentioned a little while ago, Chris Lord was in the studio, in the bar, with us talking about the review of the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal. That broke a few hours ago, but is now being widely reported across the papers, isn't it?
Yeah, it broke last night. The Financial Times broke this, and yeah, it has the potential to undermine or further undermine the transatlantic alliance. Although, if you remember, when we go back to 2021, when this deal was announced, it was seen as a big. It was seen as a snub to France, which had had a deal with Australia, which is one of the co-signatories, to supply attack submarines to Canberra. And if we go back to 2021 and the three leaders from the three participant countries in this alliance, from the UK, Boris Johnson, from Australia, Scott Morrison, and from the US, Joe Biden. And we look at today, well, it's a very different story today. And perhaps, the Trump administration hasn't been shy about, putting a few noses out of place among its allies. And this is another instance of that.
And indeed, what is being widely reported is a reaction from the United Kingdom and from Australia, which is arguably one of shock and horror, because this is something that the US, the UK and Australia really sort of publicly got into bed together about when it was first announced, causing major diplomatic ripples. Yeah,
I think both of those countries have seen this as a cornerstone of their future strategic vision in the world, and especially a focus on the Indo-Pacific. The US has made hasn't been discreet about refocusing on China and the Indo-Pacific, and that is why they say that this review is necessary, because for the US, part of the deal was that Britain and Australia would collaborate on producing these attack submarines known as SSN AUKUS, and that these would come into service in the early 2040s. But before that, the US committed to selling 5 nuclear-powered submarines to Australia from 2032. Now, what this review is based upon, and the person who's leading the review is called Elbridge Colby, has spoken publicly about, is that the US does not have the number of vessels to give 5 to Australia, or to sell 5 to Australia, given the threat from China and specifically tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Now, that's fair enough, but, I think that what's happening here, if in the long term, is if the US keeps undermining these big deals with its allies, then which of those allies is then, in a few years' time, say when we have a democratic president who, decides to refocus on Europe and the Euro-Atlantic alliance and starts talking about making certain deals and signing, how, when you're thinking in the long term, are European leaders or indeed Australasian leaders going to trust that anything that they sign or any deal that they come on board with is still going to be standing in a few years' time?
Let's move to Europe. An article in Politico that you wanted to draw our attention to, which is the previously quite strained relations between France and Germany bearing out or being borne out on the border, and efforts now to harmonise border controls between two countries, which is an unusual thing when you think of the fact that they are part of the Schengen Agreement.
Yeah, we go from nuclear-powered attack submarines to traffic jams. No less of a headache, perhaps, for French commuters, many of which in Alsace commute over the border into Germany. And I think since Friedrich Merz, the incoming German Chancellor, stepped up checks on all of Germany's borders as part of a wider immigration crackdown, that the formerly pretty frictionless border crossing between Alsace and Germany has suddenly become backed up, and traffic jams of over an hour, which is leading to some disgruntled French drivers, if you can believe that or picture that. And so I think this, there are mechanisms, there are groups within both the Bundestag and the National Assembly, particularly the Franco-German. The Franco-German Parliamentary Assembly, and they work on cooperation between the two countries. And both of those groups in those two legislative bodies are confident that they have the votes to bring forward these proposals on better working together on border security to make sure that things start flowing a bit better on that border.
Finally, let's talk about the death of Brian Wilson, one of the leading absolute giants of 1960s pop music, but an influence that was felt far beyond California. Even Bob Dylan this morning saying that he was a genius. His loss is deeply felt, but it is one of those moments when you have an opportunity to re-examine what was an astonishing catalogue.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most influential musicians of all time, and definitely during the 60s, that great explosion of musical creativity that happened in the world that has continued to reverberate like Wilson's best music through the ages. And the second troubled musical genius to die this week after Sliced Stone. There's a great obituary in the Times of Brian Wilson, if you get a chance to read it, full of just stuff that I didn't know, and great quotes. And there's all the stuff about Brian Wilson's sandbox, which became this legendary idea in rock and roll, that Brian Wilson filled his living room with sand and sat there barefoot on his grand piano, composing all of these amazing songs that came to be the Beach Boys' masterpiece, which was Pet Sounds. And he was in touch with the sand so that he could channel that California sound. A real musical legend.
Alexis Self in London, thank you so much for joining us on the line. What else have you got your eye on today, Alexis?
Well, I'm going to be listening to Pet Sounds, really. And thinking about Brian Wilson, as well as doing lots of very important work, obviously.
Absolutely. Put those headphones on and no one can tell. Lex in London, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Midori House. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson, coming to you live from the Grand Hotel Belvedere in Wengen in Switzerland. The time here in Switzerland is just nudging 8:31 a.m. So let's have a quick look at some of the other headlines we're following today. The US is to evacuate its embassy staff from Baghdad due to a heightened security threat in Iraq. It's understood Israel's ready to launch an operation into Iran. The move comes as US talks over Iran's nuclear program appear to have stalled. Meanwhile, the US has launched a review of its submarine deal with the UK and Australia. Washington said any security pact must fit its America First agenda. Argentina's President Javier Milei says his country will move its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem next year. Israel has occupied East Jerusalem, which Palestinians want as the capital of any future state. And tributes have been paid to one of the giants of 60s pop music, Brian Wilson, the co-founder of the Beach Boys, who's died aged 82. Wilson turned the group into one of the world's most influential bands. He wrote and produced some of pop's classics, such as California Girls and Good Vibrations. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It's time now for a look at some of the stories behind the headlines we're following here at Monocle Radio. Here's Monocle's Tokyo Bureau Chief Fiona Wilson talking to us about how a heritage farming company in Japan is using solar power to charge ahead. Her Monocle Minute is read today by Monica Lillis.
Japan's agriculture sector is facing challenging times. Ageing farmers, labour shortages and abandoned farmland are all piling on the pressure. Yanmar, a maker of agricultural machinery and engines founded in 1912, is tackling the problem head-on with fresh thinking. Yesterday, the company launched Save the Farms by Yanmar at its smart Nikken Sekai-designed headquarters in Tokyo. It's a new initiative that will bring together the company's latest food production and renewable energy technologies to protect and promote sustainable farming. Phase 1 includes 2 pilot schemes in Shiga and Okayama, where Yanmar is using agrivoltaics, solar panels built to allow crops to grow underneath. According to Hiroshi Okayama, Yanmar's chief digital officer, the company's aim is to integrate the various Yanmar industries and technologies to tackle economic problems as one ecosystem. The company has deep roots with Japanese agriculture, and these technological developments will bring new sources of revenue for farms entering a daunting era. Farmers are unlikely to look a gift horse in the mouth.
And my thanks to Monocle's Tokyo Bureau Chief Fiona Wilson for that piece, read by Monica Lillis. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up for our free daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. It's gently buzzy here at the Grand Hotel Belvedere here in Wengen, which is where the Monocle Radio team have decamped to. And it's a nice, relaxed breakfast feeling here at the Grand Hotel. But if you look out of the window and across to the Lauterbrunnen Valley, the impression is very much of one of the indescribable heft of nature. There are 3 peaks in front of us, the Jungfrau, the Mönch and the Eiger. Their names are a personification. The monk stands between the ogre and the virgin. Now, the power of Swiss mountains are felt from a distance here. We look across the valley. But recently, events elsewhere have shown just how vulnerable the country's communities can be. Less than 2 hours' drive from here is the village of Blatten, which last week was swallowed up by a landslide. And to tell us a little bit more about how the Swiss are reacting to such an extreme moment, I'm joined now by Serge Enderlin, who's Le Monde's Switzerland correspondent, and he's on the line from Geneva. A very good morning to you, Serge.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were at Blatten last week. What was it like?
It was beautiful and scary. Beautiful because the landscape is absolutely superb, light green pastures, trees, even ice on tops. But the thing is that in the middle of the valley, you've got this brown scree that is absolutely frightening. It's really huge.
And underneath that was effectively the village of Blatten, because thousands of homes were lost.
Well, not thousands, maybe hundreds. But the fact is that there was one of the nicest villages in Switzerland, as far as I know. I've been there once a long time ago. This was this brown chalet with flowers, with geraniums and all the stuff. Well, all the Swiss clichés were summoned to this place. And it was a famous valley. It still is a famous valley, although it's a bit damaged now, because it was not too much affected by mass tourism. It was well preserved, not too much cars, not too much noise, really the perfect cliché. Now it's a far cry from this, because the village has completely vanished. It's buried under this mud. At some places, also, it's a bit hard to measure. It's said that there is like 100 meters of mud on top of what was the village, if you can believe that.
And just looking at the way that the Swiss have reacted to this, there has been a pretty fast reaction from the government, hasn't there? I mean, yesterday, I think Parliament debated an emergency law for the benefit of the community of the Valais mountain region.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the government yesterday unfroze very quickly by Swiss means 5 million Swiss francs, if I'm right. So it means a little bit more than 15,000 Swiss francs per head. So that's equivalent to the same amount in euros, roughly. The thing is that, the country was in a state of shock because simply we do know here that the mountains are moving, and they are moving quicker by the day because of climate change. But nobody expected something that the size of it to get down, frankly. So not only the images, but the fact that the village has been completely erased, also with a minimal loss of life. Only one person is still disappeared. Is good because the mountain was monitored, so they could react in time. Actually, the village was evacuated a week before the mountain went down. But the thing is that I think it's the first time for ages that the village has been erased on the Swiss map, so to say. So really the shock is huge.
Now, once that shock subsides, the wider questions are then being asked now. And there's a big debate now that's been prompted by this in Switzerland, which is what happens in the long term. There is a huge amount of desire to rebuild, to allow people to go back to their village, to recreate and continue their lives unabated. However, there are bigger questions about whether it is so wise to rebuild in areas which are prone to what we saw last week.
Well, you do raise the question, but this is the question that nobody really wants to hear. The fact is these villages have been here around for centuries, and there is only the question, when will we rebuild this village? How much does it cost? Who will pay for it? Is it safe? Of course it's not. The mountain is still moving, but the people don't want to hear this. Last year, even 11 months ago, a huge chunk of mountain went down in the south of Switzerland, Canton Ticino, killing 7. I think it was the first time in years that so many people have been killed at the same place. And basically, the talk was exactly the same. Climate change is changing the mountains. Not everywhere, but at the 3,000 meters limits, this is where ice is not gluing the mountain as it used to do in the past. The permafrost is melting. And we have a lot of places, a lot of valleys that are inhabited and that have this kind of surroundings with mountains at this altitude. So basically, everything is monitored, is really well monitored with leaders, lasers, GPS, all the stuff. So we see it moving by the millimeter. The thing is, you can monitor mountains, but you cannot stop them from moving. So it means that probably in the future, and the discussion has not really started, but it has to, some valleys will probably have to be given up. Nobody wants to hear this because it's really shocking to say that this way. But come on, do you rebuild a street or a bridge or a mountain road every 6 months because something happens? Who will pay for that? So I think these questions just start to emerge. And basically in a mountain country, they do hurt a lot because these valleys have been inhabited for centuries. But I hardly see how we can escape raising these questions in the future.
And very briefly, I mean, are people beginning to face this question? I mean, you mentioned the fact that people are trying not to think about it too much because it is a question that's not going to go away, and the Swiss are really going to have to think about this.
Well, scientists do start to address that. Local people, it's harder. You know, in Blatten last week, this is something that you could not even really raise with the local people, almost to the bordering unpoliteness, if you see what I mean. We just lost everything. And basically the motto is we will rebuild, and you just don't feel really at ease asking, do you really think that? Do you really think it's for sure? Come on. You know, there is a gap between the perception after the catastrophe and the scientific theory that says that these mountains will have to be reassessed for the future in terms of habitability.
Serge Andelin, the Le Mans Switzerland correspondent, joining us on the line from Geneva. Thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist on Monocle Radio, live from Wengen. Now, how much does artificial intelligence play into the media? From fears that the words that come out of your radio may have been generated by AI and not by brains and keyboards of journalists — that doesn't happen here at Monocle Radio, ladies and gentlemen — to how choices made by audiences are determined by an algorithm. Well, AI was the topic running through the Wall Street Journal's CEO Council Conference in London yesterday. And our Chris Chermak met David Rhodes, Executive Chairman of Sky News. Chris began by asking David how AI impacts the audiences of Sky News.
Well, first, the audience is using AI all the time in everyday life already. So maybe they're not doing it always in the most intentional way, but, you know, anybody who ordered a meal delivered or, you know, took a ride share or traveled or, you know, checked in for something, like, used AI today. So I don't think that there's like exactly an opting out of this, and that's where some of what's being talked about here today is particularly instructive. There's not an opt-out. It's like, how do we as news organizations, or how do we as journalists adapt to this environment? And we're very focused on bringing our newsroom on the journey of adapting to this.
When it comes to adapting, is it your feeling at Sky News that AI is kind of working for you, or is it working against you? I mean, is your focus in that sense on trying to find value to create with AI, or are you more focused on responding to some of the negative repercussions that AI has?
I don't want to focus on the negatives. I mean, the negatives are the negatives. There's things you can't control, there's things you can control. So, for instance, like user interface is a great way of thinking about how we need to be leaning into this. So, a couple of generations ago in media, you know, user interface was what? It was like channel position, or like a dial even. And you started your viewing where? On the channel that you left last time. So if you literally switched off the physical TV set on a channel and you switched it on the next morning, it was on the same channel. Today, maybe you start on a start screen. Maybe it does give you the option of continue watching. Certainly a lot of Sky interfaces do that. Or it gives you the option of, you might like this if you like that. I think that is an audience expectation at this point. How do we lean into that audience expectation? Because all of that, which already is somewhat algorithmic, and so it's come a long way from that dial, that physical dial, it's going to go from algorithmic, or already has gone from algorithmic, to being an AI wreck. And we need to be at the top of the league tables when that's recommended to you.
There was a time where all of us were basically just trying to catch up when it comes to AI and how to deal with it. We were almost caught unawares in a lot of industries that this was even happening until ChatGPT came around. Do you feel that we've turned a corner on that? Are we now looking at ways to actually create that value and how it can work for us rather than reacting to the potential?
I don't think any of us are caught up or will catch up to something that's moving at this velocity. One of the most interesting things said here, and of course it was by Yuval Noah Harari, who said, if you were having this conference in London in the 19th century, 5 years on from the first commercial railroad, you might have observed that, well, what have railroads really done? I mean, not much. But that was pretty early on in the history of that. So from a historical perspective, we're really early days in the full deployment of these technologies. And no, we're not caught up to it, nor are we likely to. But we are likely to get more sophisticated about how we use it.
There's been a lot of talk about trust as well at this conference and on this stage. You talked about, in a way, going back to basics, I guess, going back to the core that is video. How at Sky News do you go about focusing on that now? This idea that you need to focus on your core brand, the thing that listeners or watchers in your case are going to trust you with the most.
Well, I talked in the session about trust having flipped from being institutional to being individual. And we have to acknowledge that that's the current trust context, that people trust individual creators or journalists, and that confers trust on a brand, whereas maybe at one time people trusted an institutional brand, and that conferred trust, conferred prestige on the people who were working at that brand. Now, look, I think Sky News is a prestige brand. Wall Street Journal is a prestige brand. Monocle is a prestige brand to a degree. People trust your work for that it's in Monocle, or they trust what our journalists do for that it's on Sky. But the new viewer, the new reader that we'll acquire is more likely to come in for you or for our different journalists personally than it is to come in for that those people work at the place where they work. And we have to acknowledge that that is the current context, that's the current trust context.
Is that easier or harder in video, TV format? How do you think about that? I'm in radio. I feel like the voice itself carries a certain amount of trust. There's something about the radio medium. How do you think about that in video when you're thinking, as you say, about the individual becoming somebody who is trustworthy? The fact that they can be seen, how important is that?
Well, radio, like podcasting, has like an intimacy about it. You probably find that people you interact with who've heard your stuff have a certain expectation of you, or a familiarity that maybe you didn't expect. I find that, right? People tend to interact with people that they've listened to differently than people that they've watched. No?
That's my question, I guess. Is there a way that you try and build that familiarity on TV these days as well? How important is that for trust?
TV is going to be more and more streaming, already is in many forms of content, but is going to be more so in news than it has been. that means, too, that it's going to acquire some of the informal characteristics of streaming and podcasting. Same as streaming and podcasting are going to acquire some of the production values that were native to TV. And so, in a way, these formats are going to meet in the middle.
And that was David Rhodes, Executive Chairman of Sky News, speaking to Monocle's Chris Chermak. You're listening to The Globalist, live from Switzerland.
Each of us has a craft, a calling that inspires us. Whether it's how a coffee is brewed, a chair is built, or how money is looked after. There's a love for the work, a care that compels you forward. For us at UBS, it's about designing a unique outcome for you. Because whatever your craft may be, ours is built around helping you succeed. UBS, banking is our craft.
Finally, on today's Globalist, I think we owe you a little bit of an explanation as to why Monocle Radio has decamped up to the Berneser Oberland to look across to some of the most beautiful mountains in Switzerland, indeed some of the most beautiful mountains in the world. We are guests of the Grand Hotel Belvedere. We're joined by Lawrence Maurer, the general manager, and also in a moment we'll be talking to Will Gordon, the man who fed us all last night and is feeding everybody here at the hotel. And also Chris Lord's come back, recently breakfasted. How was it?
It was amazing. Yeah, it was great. And lots of coffee, Emma, I'd say.
Excellent. Why are we here?
Very good question. So the hotel that we're sitting in now is owned by the Baumier Group, a French hotel group. And really, this is a sort of result of a long conversation that started between that group and Monocle. This is their first hotel the first hotel in Switzerland. What struck us really about it is first of all, it's a restoration project. So these are two old hotels that were here that they've sort of consolidated into one. And they've turned it really into a bit of a tribute to the region here. And I think, there was a conversation about how do we sort of bring Monocle up into possibly its most remote outpost we can. And so we've got a little shop here in the hotel. We've also brought with us a group of Monocle friends, I guess you could say, friends and readers, who we've brought up here to the mountains to do some trekking with us and drinking and dining and so on. And kind of really, I suppose, sort of introduce sort of us a little bit to them, but also in a way kind of, I guess, help the hotel a little bit. It's their first summer season that they're going to be embarking on imminently. How can they sort of hear what we make of it, or what do we think about it? And there's a great thought here, and I'm sure Lorenz is going to talk about this, but the way that hospitality can be a kind of engine of development, and this part of Switzerland is experiencing a lot of that right now.
Lorenz, let's bring you into this one, having been given that lovely introduction by Chris. Thank you so much for letting us in, for starters. We're absolutely delighted to be here. The thing that I quite love about this place is, and I think this is quite a sort of something that we're interested in at Monocle, is that it's not completely accessible. You have to work a little bit. There has to be a pilgrimage made in order to reach this. Some of our guests today have taken not 2 but 3 trains, and then there's a tiny little electric buggy which takes you up the hill. And there is this sense that you are really going on an adventure to a special destination, isn't there? I mean, how do you make that, how do you sort of create that atmosphere around such a special journey that has to be made?
It's funny that you say that. There was lots of discussions about that train, right? You cannot drive up with your fancy car. Impossible. There is no road. So the beautiful thing is, I think those 12 minutes on the Cog Railway are some of the most beautiful 12 minutes if you sit on the right side.
I don't think there's a
You can pass. Yes, that's true. That's true. And it's actually an asset for us, because you leave your regular life literally in the parking lot. You board the Cog Railway and you're up in the mountains. You become automatically a mountaineer, even if you just stay in the hotel and use our beautiful spa or our restaurants, but you're in the mountains. So this is actually a fantastic little asset. I think we're probably one of the only 5-star hotels in the world you can only access by Cog Railway.
Which is a lovely thought. So if you are coming, be prepared for the journey to be one of the most important things of the trip. Will Gordon, from North London originally has now made the pilgrimage up to the mountain and has now decamped there. And in fact, that inaccessibility has become an enormously important part of the food that you're serving here.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to really utilize what nature has to offer. We go foraging regularly. You have an abundance of mushrooms, walnuts, wild garlic and alpine herbs. So really we try to connect with nature as much as possible and bring it back to the table.
And just going back to you, Lawrence, when you start to embark upon a restoration project in a town which has got such a huge heritage and huge reputation for being one of the great alpine destinations, this is the place where slalom was invented. And we've had the likes of Lord Byron, J.R. Tolkien, the great and the good of literature, and indeed a James Bond film was filmed up the road. So the spotlight is already on Wengen. As the first five-star hotel in the town, what are your ambitions for the greater environment around here? Are you hoping that Wengen suddenly sort of dusts off its shoulders and sort of steps up a bit?
For sure, but we want to make it very organically and very slow, right? We talked about in the past about reawakening a little bit the Sleeping Beauty, which it really is. What not really kept up is a modern contemporary hotel offering, including a spa, without going crazy. And I think we have the best compromise here by restoring those 120-year-old buildings and put it back to their former glory.
The restoration process was supposed to take, 6 months?
It was painful, but hopefully worth it. You guys will be the judges, but it was supposed to last 1.5 years. It took 2 years.
Well, but dare we say it, you look incredibly hard work, make look pretty seamless and easy. But just talk us through the challenges, actually, of respecting a place, but making it completely fit for the 21st century, and indeed to make it still fit within the sort of the ecosystem of the town.
The funny part is here, you're in a top modern building, technically speaking, in an old shell, and with historical decoration, right? Because in the Belvedere building we are right now, we restored the building back how it was when it first opened, more than 100 years ago. But everything else is top-notch, from the sanitary to the sustainable heating, to the electricity, to the fire protection. You have never been as safe as now in this building, but nobody sees it because it's behind the scene and it takes a long time. But it's really the beauty of this project.
Will, I'm curious, when you moved up here and you started to think about building a menu and getting people who've made this big journey up here to engage with where we are, how did you start that process? How did you start to sort of learn the land around here? And I know that the menu that you served us last night, but also that you've created generally, it's all sort of within a certain kilometre radius around here. Is it about 80 kilometres or something like that?
Yeah. So I would say 100-kilometre radius. So 80% of everything that we serve is within that radius. I think the key was for us to just enjoy this opportunity to connect with each other, to get out there into the forest, down by the lakes, and just immerse ourselves with the culture and with the people, and then just very naturally you just kind of meet people, and then along the way you figure it out, just in an organic way.
Because there is this deep connection to the land here. And just briefly, Lorenz, we're going to head out in a walk shortly, aren't we? Where are we heading to this afternoon?
You're heading up to Alment and then have a nice walk down back to the village, where you have another view of the beautiful mountains surrounding us. It's just a 9-minute ride farther up with the Cog Railway, and then a nice hike down.
Sounds wonderful. Lawrence Maurer, General Manager of the Grand Hotel Belvedere, and Executive Chef Will Gordon, thank you so much for letting us into your bar. We were most grateful for that. Chris Lord, thank you for coming and pitching in as well for the programme. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers, Desiree Bandley, Chris Chermak and Monica Lillis. Our researcher was Francesca Jilks, and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance from Hunter Wang. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, all the team up at the Grand Hotel Belvedere, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.